I think that it is a complicated issue, and I think sometimes we get in the weeds about it. Can't see the forest for the trees
Right.
when, big sponsors can just write the check. These are some of the most powerful corporations, not just in sports, but in the world, and have so much weight that they can throw around. And I think that they just need to get comfortable throwing it around.
Her top priority, getting equal pay for the women's soccer team.
Should women footballers be paid the same as men? You'd be surprised at how deep this topic goes. Seriously, if you've ever seen a football forum or Twitter thread on this, you know it's like stepping into a minefield. From big-name players like Megan Rapinoe to your average fan down the pub, everyone seems to have an opinion on this. Some say equal pay is long overdue, while others claim it's just not realistic. Today, I will tell you why pay in football isn't as simple as same job, same pay. We'll break down the facts, and maybe, just maybe, we'll walk away with a bit of clarity on why this debate is, well, a bit more complicated than it looks. Let's start with a reality check. Football clubs are businesses, not charities. It might sound obvious, but it's something to remember when we're talking paychecks. The reality is that all clubs, from Barcelona to the local teams, rely on generating revenue to cover player salaries, staff wages, stadium upkeep, and more. Think about all the ways a club brings in money. You've got ticket sales, merchandise, those official jerseys and scarves, broadcasting rights, sponsorships. The list goes on. The Premier League broadcasting rights alone bring in billions. And when you look at top-tier clubs like Manchester United, they're pulling in massive sponsorship deals with brands like Adidas and Chevrolet. All that cash isn't just to keep the lights on. It's what funds those eye-watering player salaries. In football, it's all about who can pay the most. And that's directly tied to how much revenue each club generates. Just like any business, bigger income means bigger salaries. Not just the men's side works this way. Even for the women's teams, salaries are based on what each club can generate. The difference? Men's football is still bringing in way more cash than women's football. And that's where this debate really starts to heat up. Let's take the biggest stage there is, the World Cup. In 2018, the Men's World Cup generated around $6 billion in revenue. That's thanks to broadcasting deals, packed stadiums, and a global audience of over 3 billion viewers. Compare that to the 2019 Women's World Cup, which brought in $131 million in revenue with a global viewership of around 1.12 billion. That is still a massive audience, but it's just not in the same league as the men's numbers. It's not that people don't enjoy women's football. Obviously they do. But the numbers show us that men's football currently has a broader reach. Sponsors pay big bucks because they know the men's game attracts millions of eyes around the world. And for now, that reach simply isn't matched on the women's side. Take another example of the Champions League. In the 2020-2021 season, the men's UEFA Champions League generated over 2 billion euros. In comparison, the Women's Champions League brought in only 8 million euros. This gap in revenue affects everything from player salaries to sponsorships to infrastructure. Interestingly, percentage-wise, female players actually receive a bigger share of their total revenue than male players do. Hard to believe, right? Because if you only listen to the debates, you'd think it was a simple case of unfair distribution. But as always, reality's a bit more complicated. In the 2019 Women's World Cup, women's teams received about 13% of the revenue generated, while in the 2018 Men's World Cup, the men received around 7% of the revenue. That's almost double the percentage for the women. Now, before we start celebrating, let me clear that 7% of the Men's World Cup revenue is still a whole lot more than 13% of the Women's World Cup revenue. Remember, we're talking $6 billion versus $131 million. My point is that this higher percentage for women reveals something important. Women's football isn't being ignored by FIFA. They're actually allocating a bigger chunk of revenue to support the growth of the women's game. FIFA's goal with women's football is, in part, to encourage growth. They recognize that women's football is gaining popularity, and giving players a larger share of revenue is like an investment in that growth. It's a move designed to boost the women's game, encourage more players, grow leagues, and, ultimately, attract more fans. Over the last decade, the French Football Federation has invested heavily in its women's program. They've poured money into improving facilities, promoting the women's league, and even incentivizing young girls to join local clubs. And you know what? The results are showing. The French women's team is now one of the top teams in the world, and their domestic league is growing every year. But right now, most of this investment doesn't turn a profit. The French league, like many other women's leagues, still relies heavily on funding from the men's side. It's a long-term investment, with the hope that someday, women's football will be able to stand on its own financially. This brings me to the next point, which might surprise some people. Men's football right now is the financial backbone supporting women's football. Without the funds generated by the men's side, a lot of women's leagues would struggle to survive. And that's not a knock on women's football. It's just where things are at the moment. The English Football Association has openly said that part of the revenue generated by the Premier League goes toward funding the women's leagues. It's not that they don't believe in women's football. Actually, it's quite the opposite. They believe in it so much that they're willing to invest men's revenue to help it grow. But this also means that right now, women's football depends on the success of men's football. Without those big-ticket Premier League games and Champions League nights, the funding wouldn't be there to keep growing the women's game. It's a bit like an older sibling loaning their younger sibling money to start a business. The older sibling believes in them, but knows it might take a while for that business to be profitable. And don't get me wrong, this isn't a bad thing. In fact, it shows that football organizations and clubs see potential in the women's game. They're betting on it, they're investing in it, and they're hoping it'll pay off in the long run. But for now, the reality is that men's football is carrying a big part of the financial weight. And if we're talking equal pay, we have to acknowledge that financially, the men's side is still the main breadwinner. Okay guys, here's another truth bomb for you. Audience interest is what drives revenue, not just in football, but in basically every part of the entertainment world. Take Grey's Anatomy as an example. It's got a strong following, with around 75% of viewers being female, many of whom connect deeply with the characters and storylines. On the other hand, the NFL pulls in a massive, loyal audience every Sunday, but this crowd is predominantly male. It's not just about what's on TV, it's who's watching. For many shows or sports, there seems to be a natural tendency for certain groups to tune in. With football, globally, there's a clear trend of attracting a larger male audience. And since sponsors and advertisers go where they know they'll get the most views, that audience pull directly translates into revenue and, ultimately, player pay. So, when it comes to men's versus women's football, the question isn't just about talent or who deserves it more. It's about who's consistently showing up to watch. Right now, men's football has that wider pull, and that's where the big bucks are directed. There's a reason why companies like Nike, Adidas, and Coca-Cola throw millions into men's leagues. They know it's where the eyes are. Look at tennis. Men's and women's tennis get closer to equal pay because the audience demand is almost equal. Wimbledon, the US Open. People are just as excited to watch Serena Williams or Naomi Osaka as they are to see Federer or Nadal. So the pay? Much more balanced. It's that audience interest that changes the game. That brings us back to the main question. Should women footballers be paid the same as men? I mean, after everything we've covered, it's pretty clear that the answer is no. We've talked about how revenue is the main driver of salaries. If women's football brought in as much as men's football, then, absolutely, equal pay would be the obvious choice. But right now, the numbers are worlds apart. It's not about who's working harder or who's more passionate. It's just the reality of what's feasible with the money each side is bringing in. I mean, imagine you're running a business where one division makes 10 times the revenue of another. Are you going to pay both divisions the same salaries? It wouldn't make financial sense. And it's the same thing here. Clubs, leagues, and even FIFA can't just decide to pay equally if the revenue isn't there. In my opinion, should women footballers be paid more? Absolutely. But can they be paid exactly the same as men right now? Probably not, unless revenue goes up drastically. The demand needs to match the supply. It's just how business works. Now this brings me to the next question. Will women's football eventually close this revenue gap and maybe one day reach equal pay? In my opinion, it's possible. But a few things need to happen to make that a reality. To start, we need more investment. And not just from organizations like FIFA, but from big sponsors, local clubs, and even governments. The more we see brands like Nike and Adidas backing women's teams, the more visibility and funding the sport will get. Media is another massive piece of the puzzle. For years, women's games haven't had the same coverage as men's, which is why a lot of people don't know much about the players, the teams, or even the leagues. But that's changing. Channels are starting to air women's league matches more regularly, and social media has been a huge boost too. A big factor is youth engagement. The next generation is showing way more interest in women's sports, and that's huge. Kids and teens today don't see the same gender barriers in sports that previous generations did. They're growing up with heroes in both the men's and women's games. This is how you build a fan base for the future. So yeah, while we may not be at equal pay now, the potential is there. If these changes keep up, we might be looking at a future where women's football can bring in that kind of revenue. And when it does, equal pay won't even be a question anymore. It'll just make sense. At the end of the day, the football economy isn't built on good intentions. It's built on revenue. And right now, men's football simply pulls in more of it. That's why the pay gap exists. It's not about saying one game's better than the other, or that one group of players is more deserving. It's just about supply and demand. Does that mean women's football doesn't deserve more support? Absolutely not. In fact, it's growing faster than ever, and that's something worth celebrating. Women's leagues around the world are seeing more fans, more airtime, and bigger investments. And as the sport grows, so will the salaries. And that's a wrap. So, what do you guys think? Should women get the same pay as men in football, or do you see it differently? Drop your comments below. If you'd like me to cover another big question of the game, let me know that too. Before you go, don't forget to check out my recent video. Thanks for watching.